presentation is titled Teaching with Visual Media, Introducing Key Concepts, Rejuvenating the Classics, and Making New Works Accessible, and our speaker is David Pike. David is Professor of Literature and Film at American University. His most recent monographs are Canadian Cinema Since the 1980s, At the Heart of the World, and Metropolis on the Sticks, The Underworld of Modern Urban Culture, 1800 to 2001. He's published widely on 19th and 20th century urban literature, culture, and film. David is also co-editor with David Damrosch of the Longman Anthology for World Literature and co-author with Anna M. Acosta of Literature, A World of Writing. In this talk, David will provide tips for using visual media to introduce and reinforce key concepts in literature and critical thinking, and to enable beginning college students to transfer passive visual literacy into classroom success. In particular, he'll suggest strategies for using film adaptations and other visual media to refresh and deepen students' understanding of classic literary texts and to integrate new writing in world literature into the traditional literature or writing classroom. David, are you ready to get started?
I am, Amy.
Great.
Is my volume okay?
Yes.
Great. Let me put up my slides. So thank you all for joining me on a Friday afternoon. I was noticing, looking at this first slide, that I chose two very indoor pictures. And I suppose I still think of teaching visual media as something that can be done indoors. What I'm going to talk today about is I'm going to start with suggesting a few key concepts and then talk in some more detail about a couple of examples of how they might work in the classroom. Before I get to that, I wanted to briefly discuss the two images on the front slide, since one of the principles I want to talk about today, and one of the principles I have for using visual images, is never include them if they don't have meaning and if I'm not going to use them. And that's something I always try to model for my students who, as I'm sure you know, have that temptation to put decorative images on the front page or throughout their papers, especially when they're encouraged to think about visual media. So my first tip and my first rule is always to discuss them. So these two I chose for several reasons, starting with I'm going to be talking mostly about motion pictures today, and so I wanted, and about the sort of historicity of motion pictures, so I chose two images that cover something like the span of motion pictures from the early silent black and white era to the 21st century color era. Although looking at that image, I realized that how quickly things are now dating, since the setting is already a non-existent space. That's a Blockbuster video store. Blockbuster's out of business. Video stores, very soon our students will have to be informed what a video store was. So that's the first thing I like about these images and want them to speak to you about, and that they speak to me about. The second thing is what you might call the iconographic power of images, even though that we know them, even though we don't know them. Many or most of you will not have seen either of these films. Some of you will. Most of you, if not all of you, will recognize elements of each image. And that sense of sort of passive recognition of things we don't actually know is something that has become almost like the hallmark of our culture today. The top one, I love that you can recognize Charlie Chaplin simply from the pigeon-toed stance of his feet. That we require so little information to grasp what's in that image. The second thing I like about the image is that it's not just about what's on the screen, but about the act of looking and the interaction between the audience and the frame, the screen. And that's something that I'll be talking about more today, about the two kinds of looking, in a sense, both of which are students who are looking and thinking about looking. The second image I like for various reasons. Here, the recognition is differently. We recognize the movie star, although as the tech person, Jean-Pierre, today mentioned to me a couple of days ago, he wasn't sure if this was Ethan Hawke or Christian Bale, because he always gets them mixed up. And that vagueness reminds me a lot, of course, also of the way we think about cultural information. We know it and we don't know it at the same time. It's Ethan Hawke. This is also something that I expect all of you also know, although you don't know it necessarily like this is also Hamlet. This is a still from the 2000 adaptation of Shakespeare's play by Miguel Almereyda, and this is in fact one of the not most famous scenes in the play. This is the To Be or Not to Be, a soliloquy which is set both seriously and mockingly in a video store. And so I love here the conjunction between what is still there, Hamlet's existential crisis over existence, non-existence, versus the second existential crisis of which video to watch. Going from a stark choice of one thing or the other, which are opposites, to this plethora of overlapping and often absurd choices, which in many ways to me define the cultural moment in which we are, and the cultural moment in which our students have mostly grown up and of which they know very little else. And part of what I want to talk about today is how to come to grips with that shift, which I'm just, I think, beginning to recognize and think about how it works pedagogically. That sense of knowing without knowing, having all of culture but somehow second, third, fourth hand, and then also having all of these different ways of choosing and how to both confront these issues and how to, in a sense, make meaning out of them and use them productively in the classroom. So why use visual media in the classroom? And I'm presenting this in two, if you take the image, three ways. On the right, which I'm just going to reference without discussing in detail, is, if you like, the research on it, neatly summarized by a page called Pedagogy in Action from the Carleton College webpage. And then second, my sort of practical adaptation, addition to, and rules of thumb about why I find visual media useful in the classroom and to a certain degree necessary at this point in the classroom. The first, and these are my bullet points, the first one is that students already think visually. That is, they have a passive knowledge of visual media that far surpasses any sense they have of textuality. They're familiar with it, they're comfortable with it, they use it, they have an expertise in it. They may not have articulated that expertise, and they may not know how to transfer it into the academic classroom, but it's there, and I think it behooves us to figure out how to use it, as opposed to what can often happen is putting it across purposes with textuality, and thinking textually, critical thinking, how to transfer from that visual critical thinking they do every day, all the time, to what we want them to do in the classroom. And secondly, and I think it's important to distinguish these 2 points, students already think about thinking visually also. They are self-conscious about their own visual thinking. They're aware of all the different visual media in which they present themselves. Social networking, most obviously. They've grown up with a sense of being watched and performing and showing themselves that I think is very different certainly than what I grew up with. And so they have a self-consciousness and an ability to think abstractly about themselves that also can be made use of and adapted to writing and critical thinking about literature. So the first 2 reasons why use them in the classroom, because these are things that students can already do that we can make use of. Second, visual media, not so much to replace literature, but because done right, I think, they can enrich and expand the experience of reading and writing about literature. They really can, and it may seem counterintuitive, especially when you see some of the examples that I'm going to use, but I mean this very seriously. And I'm speaking in particular about pop culture. Done correctly, it can really enhance what they're getting out of literature. And fourth, and this is something that research in literary studies is just starting to really pay attention to in a sort of theoretical manner, texts are visual media, and we tend to forget this. Unless we're talking about an oral culture, everything we read begins visually, and the more conscious we become of the surface, the textuality, the visuality of what we're reading before we recognize it as texts, the more we are able to think about it, and I think the more we have moved away from simply having a book or not having a book to this, again, plethora of choices of ways in which to encounter texts, the more we need to start thinking about the different ways that the different kinds of visual experiences we have with literature affect our experience of that literature. So those are my 4 main reasons. My image here, partly just because I love M.C. Escher and I tend to love paradoxes and optical illusions in general. What I like about his reptiles is, of course, the way they're moving from flat images on a page to three-dimensionality and back. And that sort of seamless yet separate movement from one to the other is something that I would love to be able to do in the classroom. And I could say I aspire to working with text the way that Escher works with those reptiles. So here I'm going to, in the talk today, I'm going to focus primarily on number 2 of what Deandra Little and Peter Felton talk about as 3 ways to use visual materials in teaching. I'm going to talk primarily about the image as a means for interpretation, but I wanted to briefly outline the 3 different ways they think about them. And you could also add, they don't, but I do, as the 0 in the list is what I mentioned before as image as decoration. And they, of course, leave it out because it's not productive, but I think it's important to remember that it's there and to always keep in mind what am I doing with these images, how am I using them, how am I making meaning with them, how am I bringing them in dialogue with the texts that I'm using. And to give you an example of image as illustration, I've included a picture of an axolotl, which is almost, it's not essential, but it's a very useful illustration if you're teaching Julio Cortázar's wonderful 1956 short story Axolotl, because very few of us know what an axolotl is, and even if we know what it is, seeing one has a totally different effect than reading about one, although reading about one will give us all sorts of fascinating information that will lead to number 2 in the bullet point, helping in interpretation. Images, of course, are also textual. The axolotl is the central image of this story. It's a story. Cortázar was an Argentinian writer who spent most of his adult life in exile in Paris, and Axolotl is a story about exile. It's a slightly fantastic, slightly macabre story about a man who spends his time in the Botanical Garden Zoo in central Paris looking at an axolotl in an aquarium and ends up, in a sense, changing places with it. It's about the double experience of both alienating and belonging of the exile. The more you read and discuss and look and think about axolotls, the deeper the meaning of that image becomes. I'm not going to talk about it today, but just thinking about that image as a way of opening up the interpretation of the story. The third way to use visual materials I'm also not talking about today, because this is image as illumination, as Little and Felton call it, and this is using an image, as so many of them are, visual media, as works of art in their own right. So not only as a means to interpret literature or as illustration, but as a work of art in their own right. And my example here would be the Mexican artist Diego Rivera's mural in the National Palace of Mexico City of the great city of Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital that existed in where Mexico City is now, as did the axolotl. It shared a space with it. And I'm not going to discuss the many ways in which you could put Rivera's mural in dialogue with Cortázar's story, but they, in a sense, exist equally as works of art and speak to each other in fascinating ways. And that would be what something like image as illumination would mean. Now, to move, if you like, from the sublime to the ridiculous, I want to think of images as a means for interpretation. The ridiculous is not Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, but the way, in fact, that most of our students will have come through the lottery, which is through something like South Park, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. I use this example, I wouldn't say it's polemical, but I really want to push the question of what it means to rejuvenate literature and to sort of what it means to take older literature in the world of today. And I should preface my choice of Jackson's The Lottery with a story from my work with Anna on Literature World of Writing. We left Jackson's The Lottery out of the first edition of the textbook because, in a sense, we couldn't teach it anymore. It had somehow become bankrupt to us. It didn't seem to speak to us. It seemed to be flat and not impart any meaning besides the sort of obvious horror of the original story. Many people disagreed with us, and just really wanted it in the second edition. In order to do this with a good conscience, we had to figure out ourselves how to teach it. And working through this, we discovered that the way to make it work for us, which was also what was blocking our approach to it, was in fact South Park. This is a 2008 episode from this cartoon series, if you can call it, I suppose you have to call it a cartoon, which is a literal rewriting of Jackson's The Lottery, with dialogue repeated from the story and from the 1969 motion adaptation from Encyclopedia Britannica, which you see on the other side, in the context, and you see Old Man Warner reproduced almost exactly over here. It's in the context of a meditation of celebrity culture. The main subject of the episode is Britney Spears and celebrity culture. And what I realized thinking about why South Park was that our students more and more, and this is what I was talking about earlier as I began, they know things without knowing them. So part of what I think is interfered, making it hard for me to teach the lottery, was in the sense that they had this second, third, fourth-hand idea of it from things like South Park. Our culture is so much now not a culture where you have to discover things and find things, but where you already know things and you have to figure out how to make meaning of them. They know, and to a certain degree, they know all of the literary canon in these strange, refracted ways. You might think of Alicia Silverstone's character in Clueless, who has memorized Hamlet because, or at least because of Mel Gibson, that she knows all of Mel Gibson's lines from the film of Hamlet. This is both a knowledge of Hamlet and not a knowledge of Hamlet. My 9-year-old son has just started watching the 90s PBS series Wishbone, which is a whole series of quite fascinating, both faithful and non-faithful adaptations of literary classics, where a small, cute dog plays the role of all of the main characters, including, though we haven't seen it yet, I'm sure, Hamlet. So my point here is that we have two choices. We can either sort of leave this refracted, if you'd like, distorted, sometimes perverted knowledge of the canon as an unacknowledged sort of elephant in the room or roadblock to getting at what we would call the original works, or we can try to make it a positive tool in our teaching repertoire. And so for me, this does come to mean, well, how can you make South Park productive in teaching the lottery? And I won't have time to go into enormous detail on this, but some ideas, and which will be, first rule, we have so many different sources, let's use them. I find the more different adaptations, and here I've given stills from 3 adaptations of the lottery, from 1969, a 1996 TV movie drama, a 90-minute long from NBC television, and then the 2008 version from South Park. These are all of the final scene. The more we use of them, the more we can, in a sense, distract students from what they already know about it and get them to start thinking analytically about all the different connections between them. In a sense, we can take them out of what the speakers in the last session were talking about, take them out of the issues discussion and have them start thinking formally. And the more you can start comparing different versions of things, the easier it is to think formally about them. In practical terms, the Encyclopedia Britannica film is available streaming online on the Britannica webpage. South Park also has its own webpage where you can watch all of their episodes. So both of these are 20-minute episodes that could either be assigned for students to watch and write about and compare with the story, or they could be shown in class. The 96 film, it's a pretty lousy film, though it's interesting in the context, is available on DVD, but I don't know if it would be worth the 90 minutes to show it, though clips of it might be interesting. Some students might find it interesting to work on. But the kind of project I'm thinking about could easily be done with the two films on the left. And I would begin either with an assignment away or a discussion in class, list the similarities between them, and then start thinking about the differences, thinking about what changes. And what you find when you start examining them is that what's what's consistently retained in all the versions is the basic concept of the lottery. The idea of the scapegoat mob violence by what we can call ordinary good people, the small town setting. Everything else to a certain degree, or a lot of it, changes, and changes in very interesting ways that can not only get students thinking abstractly about their own cultural situation, about what might make sense about South Park, but also starts to illuminate in interesting ways what's going on in the original story. So it can get them to think about the original 1948 story in different ways, and in ways that are beyond simply getting worried about the theme of the lottery, which, since Jackson wrote the story, has become so much a part of our culture. It's founded the entire genre. Think about it, the zombie movie is based on the same idea as Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. It's so familiar now that there's really very little to discuss as such about it. And so this is also to think about other ways of making this story productive besides that original brilliant idea that she had. So briefly, a couple of the changes that do occur. We get a heightening sense of violence, which is most obvious in the bottom scene of South Park, where, and I apologize for the graphicness of the image, where this is Britney Spears, who near the beginning of the episode loses most of her head in a suicide attempt. And this becomes both the appalled moment of the film. It reminds us, of course, of how shocking the violence in Lottery is, that Trey Parker, the writer and director, has clearly found an analogy in the present day of the shockingness of the original, but also because nobody except the kids in South Park pay any attention to how horrible this is. She doesn't die. She simply goes around missing most of her head. It also then becomes a commentary on the townspeople, which actually precisely duplicates the other shocking part of the lottery, but again in a contemporary context. So this allows the students to think about both of them and to get a sense of what the original shock of the lottery might have been like. So a second thing that you can start to think about is to talk about the way that each of these works with space. And this is something that visual media makes easier to discuss in story is space and setting, because space and setting is, of course, easier to notice and think about in visual media. And once you start to look at them, at all four of them, you will notice, for instance, that in Jackson's The Lottery, the setting is very confined, very constricted. We have no way of moving out from the space of this small town and really of the town square. The film of 1969 does exactly the same thing. Both of the later films open up in different ways to a much broader palette, a much broader context, and a much broader space. And that's something that is really interesting in terms of what's going on in the contemporary day. Again, in the sense of, in The Lottery, there's no sense of choice. In the present day, there's always a sense of choice, even as we have the same stark social contrast. Now, once you've started to deal with all of this, analyze all of these things in detail, list them, you can then start to put them together and to ask what's at stake in each of the versions, what does each tell us, and how does it allow us to see the original story differently. And I'll just briefly mention several different rubrics or ways of thinking about this. The first would be thematically, although I would tend to avoid this discussion. It could be made fruitful if you're talking about the changes in the way you might think about this idea of community versus individual, the different ways that it addresses it, the different ways it deals with the morality of the participants, which I think is something that changes in the different versions and is something we can think about in Shirley Jackson's. The two approaches that I find most interesting and most helpful for students are, first of all, thinking about them historically. Once we're looking at adaptations from different periods, and once we can see the similarities and differences, we can also start to think about how they are really a product of the time in which they were made. Especially Jackson's 1948 story really becomes a product of a post-war, of a immediate post-war America in a particular mood. The 1969 film, similarly, especially with its cinema verite, newsreel style, feels very much like a product of the 1960s. And then the later two movies, very much in two different ways, feel and reflect different concerns that are much more related to the present day. And so this also allows students to think about their own situation, their relationship to both the past and to the present, and find ways of talking about these in more abstract and coherent ways than simply talking about their own experiences. A third rubric, which would be a more formal approach, would be also to think about genre and form, both the differences between literary and cinematic depictions of the story, what changes when you visualize the images of the lottery, and also to think about three different kinds of motion pictures. The educational short here, the full-length drama here, which has a full narrative arc, and then an episode in a long-running comedy series. So these are some of the things, just sketching out some of the ways you might use the adaptations of the lottery to open it up, refresh it, and to a certain degree deal with all of the weird associations the students will have and will bring to it, whether we like it or not, and to recognize that they are not coming to anything they read with anything like a clean slate, that they're coming to them very much with a whole set of bizarre, both concrete and more nebulous conceptions. And then I want to conclude by looking briefly at literally widening the perspective, what you might be able to do with a new work, and how a new work, both how visual media might work in a new work and how that might also speak to the material I've just been discussing. And the slide here is from Marjane Satrapi's graphic memoir, Persepolis, which was first published in 2000. And then the images on the right-hand side are three frame grabs from the film adaptation that she made with a French collaborator a few years later. And there are very interesting differences, similarities and differences between the film and the memoir, which I'm not going to talk about today. What I want to focus on is thinking about using these two texts in relation to the material from the lottery that I was just discussing. And to think about here, we have another way of thinking about especially the present day, the idea of choice, and the relation between a closed community and an opening up. What's fascinating about Persepolis in this context is, of course, that the community it portrays, it takes place, it's narrated from the point of view of the young Marjane, who is raised by a secular, privileged Iranian family, but grows up after the revolution under the theocracy in Iran during the 1980s. So she is an outsider within a very constrictive, constrained society, very much resembling the kind of society that Jackson depicts in The Lottery. The difference, and of course with the same dangers. In the scene I show you here, she goes to the black market to buy pop music tapes, Michael Jackson, Kim Wilde, Iron Maiden. The difference is that she has this outside world that speaks to her, that gives her a way of thinking about herself differently than the world of the lottery. Again, if the world of the lottery and the 1948 50s America it portrays is one that has no escape from it. And you might think back to the claustrophobia of that story, to that sense that no world exists outside of the world of the lottery, the world of this town. Here, she is equally confined, but the pop culture gives her a way out. Satrapi is, of course, perfectly well aware that there's an incredible paradox in finding liberation through consumerism. After all, she's just buying these tapes, and to a certain degree from pop music. What could be more conformist and from the old version of cultural critique than something like Michael Jackson or Kim Wilde? What could be less revolutionary? But her argument in this context, and I think this is very similar to South Park, although less nihilistic, is that depending on the context, anything can have any kind of meaning. And this is not just a postmodern nihilism. It's a sense that we have to be very much aware of the context in which any icon, any work of art, any visual media, the context in which we are encountering it. And to take that into account as we think about it, and that different things can have different meanings for different people, without necessarily either liberating them or compromising them. And so this last image, I think, becomes a way, again, of trying to come to terms with the world in which we now live and teach, where our students, to a certain degree, have already been exposed to everything, And so what we need to teach them is not so much, it's almost impossible to surprise them. We can still shock them. If you think back to Jackson's story, in 1948, the lottery was both shocking and surprising. I think it is no longer surprising, it remains shocking. Just like South Park. South Park doesn't surprise us, it shocks us. So if we assume we can't surprise them anymore, and that to a certain degree shock is not much use without surprise, how do we help them make sense of just this enormity of different versions, different possibilities of things? And to a certain degree, I think that with adaptation, with visual media, with bringing in a sense, bringing up front and making explicit what's actually going on around them in their own lives, we can start to find ways of making it, of trying to make it productive, and especially to find ways of not getting rid of the old canon, but finding ways of seeing how it speaks to now and how we can make sense both of what was there originally and of all the different things that have happened to it since. And I will just end on that image of thinking back to Hamlet in the video store with his myriad choices, and look forward to discussing this further with you and having questions. And I will also post the slides of these to give you the references for this. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Jean-Pierre, are you on the line right now? I was just going to see if he could. There are a couple people who have raised hands, so I was going to see if I could unmute some folks. I could try to do it myself, but it doesn't always goes well for me.
Hi, Jean-Pierre.
1 second. Sure. We'll start with Sumita Roy. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't seem to get the link.
Hello, Sumita.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was just commenting on these pictures and wondering that in terms of interpreting knowledge or acquiring knowledge through an analysis of images, in current Iran or Middle East, where you would find a lot of restrictions for media, and especially in Iran right now, I think Facebook was banned recently. A lot of the pictures here is the sole female individual sort of constrained by male figures, but a lot of the constraints come from the females themselves. The outer community or the inner community, the private space and the public space. The public space could be peopled by men, and the private space is peopled by women in places like Afghanistan, Iran, in a lot of these restrictive societies. And I was just wondering, in terms of interpreting knowledge or gaining new knowledge, how would you comment on that?
Well, that's a great question. It's also a very large question, which you may be more qualified to answer than I am. But I think you're absolutely right to raise the question of how gender enters into this. And I'm just thinking about the most conventional of all of the versions of the lottery that I showed you is, in fact, the one where a man replaces a woman as the victim within the lottery. Which is the 1996 NBC television drama, which actually takes the original story of the lottery, which is exactly the scenario you described, and puts it within sort of the conventional narrative arc of an action drama. He's a man that lives in the city that has been traumatized by this past that he can't remember. He ends up, his father dies and asks him to go take his ashes to his mother's grave. He returns to the town and discovers the secret about his mother, who had been the one who had been stoned in a lottery when he was a child, and he had, of course, helped to stone her. And he eventually escapes again with this information. That would be sort of the most conventional version of it, where the woman would be, where the women, in a sense, don't even enter into the picture. I don't. It's you. I would like to hear more about from you on Persepolis, because I think you have a stronger sense of how it comes out, especially in the context of Iran. But certainly that would be something to think about. Students do feel feel much more generally empowered to use images, even as, of course, those images can constrain them. I'm assuming this is part of what Satrapi means when she has Marjane finding liberation by listening to Kim Wilde. We don't generally think of Kim Wilde as revolutionary, or for that matter, Marjane is no revolutionary either, and yet somehow she also finds this liberating. And I mean, that paradox is part of what fascinates me. I certainly don't have an answer to it, though.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, in context of that, even the Taliban culture. I mean, this is so appropriate. This image that I'm looking at right now, because if you look at the news stories that's going on in Afghanistan, the women's role. I mean, banning of schools for girls and education for girls. It's very rampant right now. But this is a very powerful image. I just wanted to comment on the gender aspect here.
Yes. No, you're right. But you're also very right to observe to us how charged. I mean, of course, texts have been banned many times too, but there is something about the immediacy of images that makes them, in a sense, even more charged, both negatively and positively. They can pack an enormous amount of sort of affective information in a way that texts take much longer to unpack, and that's why they're both useful teaching tools and also, if you like, dangerous teaching tools, because they can totally overwhelm what you want to do with them if you don't use them in the right way, as they can culturally, obviously, as you're referring to. I'm thinking more in the pedagogical framework, but you're actually right in the political framework. The same questions could come up.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Pierre, is there anyone else with a raised hand? I don't think
I don't believe I see it. Any, no.
Okay. Well, David, I was wondering, what are you talked about, some of the challenges of getting to a place where you could find a way to creatively teach the lottery, and I was wondering, what are some other texts that you, are either were challenged by finding an entry point to, or that you're just really kind of into teaching right now?
Well, I suppose what I'm really into this point is thinking about this. Not a theoretical question isn't quite the right word, but I suppose it is thinking about this issue of. I mean, we tend to, partly because I think this is how I encountered so many canonical texts, is in this sort of direct, intimate, immediate fashion. But when one is teaching them, and I think this is also how one was still able to encounter them when I was growing up. I think the way one is teaching them now, and the way when students come to them, is they come to them in such a mediated way that I suppose that's the issue that fascinates me now, is how to figure out that mediation, how to theorize it, how to make sense of it, and how to use it productively. I suppose the thing it happens to me most frequently with is what I teach. I teach very frequently with another hat. I teach Dante. And this happens to me all the time. This is a medieval poem that speaks to people both through the thousands of references you get to the Inferno, for instance, all over. This is one of the most present texts in all of our culture. Mm-hmm. It also speaks to people, because of course it's all about theology, it speaks to many believers in a very direct way and engages them in a way that to a certain degree exceeds sort of the literary text. It raises all of these challenges. And so the challenge is always to try to figure out a way. On the one hand, you want to reproduce, it's the same as teaching something like Shakespeare, you want to reproduce the original setting, the original context, what you could call the historicist impulse, the idea to recreate what it was like when it was there. But at the same time, you know that it's impossible, and you also know that the interest, in fact, must have more to do with the present day. If we're still reading something today, it's because it speaks to us today. And so it's a certain way of finding new ways of going back and forth between those two perspectives, and especially finding ways of engaging students into that, I mean, for me, that's the great pleasure of reading and teaching literature, is being able to move back and forth like that. Finding ways of engaging students into it. I found that visual media work, especially movies and adaptations, work very well that way, as providing a sort of a standpoint in the presence which isn't simply personal experience, as opposed to which is what you would students will tend to use in that mediation. They'll tend to simply say, well, this is what I think and this is what the text is doing. Instead, if they have a way of triangulating that with something like Persepolis, with something like even something like South Park, it gives them a way to voice their present standpoint, but without it being quite so personal. It gives them a way of abstracting. It's sort of difficult still for me to grasp that South Park can be a way of abstracting from the present, but it really works. If you can get them to stop thinking about it just in terms of pop culture and start to think about it in terms of form, it really, they can step out of themselves, which is what I think one always wants students to do, is to step out of themselves while also remaining engaged.
Oh yeah, that's really well said. That's a good point. Well, let's see. Okay, here's a question. Let's see. It's a little bit long. This is from Diane Rubino. She wonders. She says, I have a very practical question. I've tried to introduce more visual elements into my teaching. My class is Monday night. Most of my students are older and have worked all day and are tired. I believe they need the support of the visual cues to underscore learning. None of the other professors do this and instead deliver the typical word graph dump on a slide. Any thoughts on getting the students more on board with this style of teaching?
So is the question is that the students feel that this isn't legitimate because the other teachers don't do it? So how to persuade them that this is not just sort of babysitting? Exactly. Yes. Oh, I suppose that's a good question. It's the same problem that you encounter when you teach pop culture. Students are, and it's interesting that you mentioned with older students. Younger students also strangely enough, tend to be very snobby. I found it's much easier to get students to take Dante seriously than to get them to take South Park seriously. They may not enjoy it, but they feel somehow it's good for them on some way or another, even though they don't like it. And so, to me, the way to do it, one way to do it is to give them up front a set of things that they have to look for in them, so that you treat it as a genre, as an object for formal analysis, as well as simply as a way into the text. So if you're showing them, say, the 1969 version of The Lottery, I would ask them, as part of their watching it, to think about it visually. How is it filmed? What kind of framings does it use, for instance? What's the visual style? Students will need a little bit, as with writing about literature, they need clues onto the vocabulary. They're usually very astute observers, though. Once you give them a vocabulary to discuss that, which can be done pretty quickly, they will really get into doing that. So that would be one way, is that as I was saying about images at the beginning of my talk, you always treat it as valuable on its own terms. Mm-hmm. And once you start to give it that importance, then the students will feel that it's important. If you're only treating it, in a sense, as a way into the original work, they will sense that, and they will, in a sense, they won't. So in a sense, you have to give it enough credit on its own terms. And what I was trying to suggest today in The Lottery is that one can give even something like South Park credit on its own terms while also discussing The Lottery itself. And so I would give them work ahead of time, preparation for it, so that you're framing it in such a way that it has value in itself. And that's at least what I do in my own teaching. Because I encounter this a lot, especially when I teach more popular culture. It's always a problem that you encounter.
That's interesting. Thanks for your question, Diane, and thank you for your answer, David, and for your great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I can tell from the positive comments that our guests enjoyed it too. So thank you again for your time.
Oh, well, thanks, Amy, and thank you all for giving me some of your Friday afternoon. It was a pleasure.